The snow from February's historic blizzard hasn't even fully melted yet, and 3 more winter storms are already lined up back to back, aimed directly at the same 25 states that were just hit by one of the most powerful blizzards in recent memory. Let that sit for a moment, because what's happening right now in the atmosphere above the Midwest and the Northeast is something that forecasters are calling one of the most persistent and relentless winter setups they've tracked in years. Not one storm, not 2, 3 separate storm systems, moving one after the other along the same general path, targeting millions of people who are still digging out from one of the most powerful blizzards this country has seen in over a decade. Stay with me in the next few minutes because we're going to walk through all 3 of these storms together, where they're coming from, what they're carrying, which one has forecasters most concerned, and why the atmospheric pattern that created February's record-breaking blizzard stayed in place after the storm moved out. We're also going to get into the bigger picture, why 3 storms are forming back-to-back like this, and what it tells us about the rest of this winter. And we're going to talk about something that I think you're going to find genuinely surprising. The worst storm of these 3, it hasn't even arrived yet. Here's what caught my attention first. When the Fox Forecast Center released its 3-storm outlook, they confirmed that all 3 systems are targeting 25 states across the Midwest and Northeast through the middle of next week. AccuWeather's meteorologists are watching the same setup. USA Today has reported on the forecast. SevereWeather.eu has confirmed the ice accumulation threat. This isn't a single source painting a dramatic picture. This is a multi-agency, multi-outlet weather story that is fully confirmed and actively developing right now. And the reason it matters so much, the reason this particular sequence of storms is worth your full attention, is the timing. We're not talking about a storm arriving in the middle of January when winter is expected to be at full force. We're talking about 3 storms arriving as the calendar turns to March, the first day of meteorological spring. That irony alone tells you something important about the state of the atmosphere right now, and we're going to get to that part of the story. But first, let me give you the overview of why this sequence feels so different from a typical stretch of winter weather. The blizzard that hit this region just days ago was a Category 3 on NOAA's Winter Storm Index. It shattered all-time snow records in multiple states. While it left hundreds of thousands of homes without power across 7 states that were placed under emergency declarations. The storm was rated a billion-dollar weather disaster. People who lived through it know exactly what February's blizzard did. They saw it, felt it, and many of them are still recovering from it. That blizzard is the measuring stick we're going to use throughout this entire video, because every new storm in this sequence is going to be compared to what Hernando did. And here is the first thing you need to understand before we go any further. None of these 3 storms is expected to match the blizzard. Fox Weather, AccuWeather, and the National Weather Service have all confirmed that. But less than Hernando covers an enormous range of possible outcomes, and somewhere in that range, Storm 2 has forecasters paying very close attention, not because of snow totals alone, because of what's riding alongside the snow in a band that stretches from the Ohio Valley all the way through the mid-Atlantic. Before we go any further, if you're watching this and you're located in one of the states in the crosshairs this week, drop a comment below and tell me which state you're in. Whether it's Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, Michigan, Kentucky, Virginia, or anywhere in the Northeast, let us know where you're watching from. It helps us understand who this is reaching. And honestly, it's going to be interesting to see just how wide that geographic net actually is. Hit the like button if you've been following the winter storm coverage, subscribe so you don't miss the updates as Storm 2 and Storm 3 continue to develop, and let's get into this together. Because what's happening in the atmosphere right now starts with the storm that just ended, and understanding Hernando is the only way to truly understand what's coming next. If you watched the news coverage of February's blizzard and thought to yourself, I haven't seen anything like that in a long time, your instincts were right. Winter Storm Hernando wasn't just a big storm, it was a generational one, a storm that rewrote record books in multiple states simultaneously and did so in a way that even experienced meteorologists paused to acknowledge was genuinely historic. Hernando arrived as a bomb cyclone, a storm system whose central pressure dropped rapidly enough to officially qualify as a bomb cyclone. When meteorologists use the term bomb cyclone, they're describing a specific, measurable atmospheric event, a storm that deepens at an extraordinary rate within a defined window. Hernando didn't just meet that threshold according to NOAA's Weather Prediction Center. Its central pressure dropped sharply within a 24-hour period, thus meeting the meteorological definition of a bomb cyclone. To put that in terms you can feel rather than just measure. That kind of deepening produces the rapid intensification that brought blizzard conditions to the northeast within hours. The snow totals that resulted were staggering. Rhode Island bore the full force of the storm's heaviest precipitation band. Providence recorded close to 38 inches of snow, with the bulk of it falling over a roughly 2-day period, the heaviest single storm total ever recorded at that location. The previous all-time record for a single snowstorm in Rhode Island had been set during the legendary blizzard of 1978, a storm that defined a generation of New Englanders. Hernando didn't just surpass that record, it broke it by a significant margin. At peak intensity, snow was falling in Providence at a rate of 4 inches per hour. That is an exceptionally intense snowfall rate that accumulated quickly across the region. Rhode Island wasn't alone. 7 states issued emergency declarations as the storm broke snowfall records across multiple locations from the mid-Atlantic through New England. 5 states between New Jersey and Massachusetts saw snowfall totals reaching at least 30 inches. New York City experienced its heaviest snowstorm in more than a decade. Newark, New Jersey recorded its second largest snowfall total in history, coming within a fraction of an inch of the all-time record set back in 1996. Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Maine, Vermont, West Virginia, and North Carolina, each one of them recorded significant totals from a storm that covered an almost unbelievably wide geographic footprint. And the snow was only part of the story. The wind turned Hernando into a true blizzard, which is a specific meteorological designation, not just a word for a bad snowstorm. Blizzard conditions require sustained winds and visibility that reduces to near zero, and Hernando delivered that across dozens of coastal and inland locations from New Jersey to Massachusetts. The peak wind gust recorded on land came in at nearly 100 miles per hour, a hurricane-force reading in the middle of a snowstorm. Multiple major airport locations, including Boston's Logan Airport, recorded gusts well above 60 miles per hour. Snow fell alongside lightning strikes at certain points along the coastline. Trees came down across the region. At peak impact, more than 650,000 homes and businesses across the Northeast lost power. 7 states issued states of emergency. Rhode Island issued a full travel ban to allow roads to be cleared. NOAA officially rated Hernando a Category 3 on its Winter Storm Severity Index, a rating that accounts not just for snowfall, but for the geographic scale of the storm and the size of the population affected. The final economic toll placed Hernando in the category of $1 billion weather disaster. Now here's why all of this matters for the storms we're about to examine. Hernando wasn't just a weather event, it left a physical footprint on the landscape that is still present. The snowpack in parts of the northeast and midwest is significantly elevated above normal. The ground temperatures in affected regions are still well below the frost line. The rivers and waterways that drain those regions are carrying above normal snow water equivalent waiting to melt. This is the physical context that the 3 new storms are moving into. They are not arriving on a clean slate. They are arriving on top of everything Hernando left behind. There is also an atmospheric context, the same large-scale weather pattern that allowed Hernando to form the same positioning of Arctic air, jet stream behavior, and pressure gradient that fueled one of the most powerful nor'easters in recent memory, did not simply pack up and leave after the blizzard ended. The atmospheric pattern that produced Hernando stayed in place rather than breaking down after the storm moved out. AccuWeather's meteorologist Alex Sosnowski described it this way. Fresh Arctic air will set the stage for a storm early next week that could bring disruptive snow and ice to parts of the Midwest and Northeast. That was confirmed by the Fox Forecast Center, which noted that the 3 new storms reflect an ongoing battle between lingering cold air digging south from Canada and warmer air from the Gulf being pulled north. That pattern, cold Arctic air pushing south while Gulf moisture moves north, is what has been driving the back-to-back storms across the Midwest and Northeast all winter. Hernando was one result of it. The 3 storms now forming are another result of it. An understanding that this is a pattern, not a series of isolated events, is the key to understanding why this week matters so much. The atmosphere that created Hernando never fully went away, and now that same atmospheric pattern is already generating the next round of storms. Let's look at what arrives first, because Storm 1 is already on the radar, already moving, and it's bringing something with it that most people aren't fully tracking yet. Storm 1 is the one that isn't getting the big headlines, and in a way, that's exactly what makes it interesting to look at closely. because its role in this sequence is less about the snow it drops and more about what it sets up for everything that follows. Let's walk through what Storm 1 actually is and what it does. According to the Fox Forecast Center, the first system begins breaking out along the leading edge of a fresh surge of cold air early Saturday. It starts in Montana, and the Dakotas, the same general region where so many of this winter's storms have begun their eastward march. From there, it spreads across the upper Midwest and into the Great Lakes by Saturday evening, moving quickly and efficiently along the southern edge of that Arctic air mass. The word you need to hold on to when thinking about Storm 1 is fast-moving. This system is not designed by the atmosphere to sit and spin and dump enormous snowfall totals in one location. It's a quick, efficient clipper-type event, the kind of storm that sweeps through, leaves a fresh coat of snow on surfaces that were already cold and possibly still snow-covered from last week, and moves on. The Fox Forecast Center confirmed that accumulations from this system should be limited, particularly in the major metro areas along the eastern seaboard. Boston, New York City, and Providence are all in the path for some snowfall on Sunday morning. But the totals expected in those cities are modest, a coating to an inch in the biggest coastal cities. Interior locations, Pittsburgh, Albany, Manchester, New Hampshire, stand to see a bit more, as the colder air gets more concentrated as you move inland and away from the moderating effect of the Atlantic. But here is what Storm 1 is doing that matters beyond its own snowfall totals. It is acting as the advance team for the colder, sharper Arctic air that follows directly behind it. When a fast-moving system like this one sweeps through, it scours the atmosphere, pulling fresh Arctic air down from Canada and positioning it across the Midwest and Northeast like a cold foundation that the next storm system has to work with. Storm 1 reinforces the cold air across the region and prepares the surface conditions that Storm 2 needs to produce its most significant ice and snow threat. There's also a physical consequence worth noting here that severeweather.eu and the Fox Forecast Center both flagged. Storm 1 is going to be depositing fresh snow on top of regions that already carry significant snowpack from Hernando. Parts of the northeast still have substantial snow depth on the ground. When a new layer of snow, even a modest one, falls on top of an existing settled snowpack, the combined accumulation can create conditions that are more significant than either layer would be alone. The ground is cold. The surfaces are already primed. Even a light coating adds to what is already there, and what is already there is considerable. Storm 1 reaches the interior northeast early Sunday morning, and by Sunday afternoon its snowfall contribution is largely wrapping up in the major population centres. This is a Saturday through Sunday event, and the areas with the most meaningful accumulation from this first wave sit north and west of the major coastal metros, the interior valleys of New York and New England, western Pennsylvania, and the southern Great Lakes. For viewers in those areas, Sunday morning is the moment to pay attention to. But here is the question that deserves more attention than Storm 1's snowfall totals. What is already in motion to the south and west, while Storm 1 is still moving through the northeast? Because while millions of people are watching Storm 1 do its work on Sunday morning, a more complex storm system is already developing to the south. The air masses are colliding along a front that is going to start behaving in a very specific way once the temperature contrast reaches the right level. Gulf moisture is beginning its northward surge. Cold air is anchoring itself across the Great Lakes. The conditions that forecasters have been watching most closely are not the conditions behind Storm 1, they're the conditions developing along Storm 1's trailing edge. That trailing edge is where Storm 2 is born, and once you understand that Storm 1 and Storm 2 are not separate, unrelated events but actually connected systems, the first one setting the temperature stage and the second one exploiting exactly what the first one leaves behind, the sequence shows how each storm is connected to the one before it, each one setting up the conditions the next one needs. AccuWeather confirmed that Storm 1 functions essentially as the smaller, quieter precursor, the event that in another week might not have made major headlines on its own. But in the context of this week, in the context of what Hernando just did and what the atmosphere is now being primed to do again, Storm 1 is anything but irrelevant. It is the first in a connected sequence of 3 storm systems, and Step 2, the one that has forecasters paying closest attention to a very specific geographic band running from the Ohio Valley down through Kentucky and into the Carolinas. Step 2 is arriving fast. Storm 1 isn't the one that has forecasters losing sleep. That one comes next. And it's bringing 2 completely different threats at the same time, in the same storm, aimed at different parts of the same region simultaneously. Let's get into it. Storm 2 carries 2 separate threats operating at the same time, and it is arriving in a region still carrying snow and cold from February's blizzard. Both threats deserve to be walked through carefully rather than summarised in a headline. Let's start with the timing. Storm 2 develops along the trailing edge of the cold front that Storm 1 leaves behind. It begins to organise on Sunday night, and then pushes through the Midwest and into the Northeast through Monday. According to the Fox Forecast Centre, this second wave involves a phenomenon that meteorologists call overrunning. Here is what that means in plain language. A surge of warm, moisture-loaded air from the Gulf of Mexico gets pulled northward by strengthening winds at the surface. That warm, wet air rides up and over the cold air that is anchored at the surface, the same Arctic air that Storm 1 just reinforced across the region. Warm air above, cold air below. The result of that collision is not a clean, simple snow event. It is a layered storm system that produces different kinds of precipitation in different locations, sometimes within miles of each other, depending entirely on where that boundary between warm above and cold below happens to sit. The first threat is snow. The Fox Forecast Centre confirmed that higher-end computer model scenarios show a meaningful swath of snow for Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and potentially New York City through Monday. These are not small cities, these are some of the most densely populated metro areas in the country, and they are all positioned within the zone where Storm 2's heaviest snow is expected to fall. The snow band associated with Storm 2 is expected to add meaningful accumulation on top of surfaces that are already carrying snow from Storm 1 and from the February blizzard. At the lower end of the model guidance, a more mixed precipitation scenario reduces the pure snow totals. At the higher end, the snow band is sharper and heavier. And here is the part that matters most about that uncertainty. Forecasters, as of this reporting, have not been able to pin down exactly where the snow-rain transition line sets up. That line, the boundary between temperatures cold enough for snow and temperatures warm enough for rain, is the defining factor in whether Chicago gets a significant snow accumulation or a messy wintry mix. Whether Detroit's Monday morning looks like a snow event or an ice event. Whether Philadelphia ends up on the snow side of Storm 2 or the ice side. The exact track of Storm 2 is still carrying enough uncertainty that the difference between the storm's northern and southern scenarios represents meaningfully different outcomes for millions of people. But the snow, as significant as it is actually not the part of Storm 2 that has garnered the most attention from forecasters. That distinction belongs to the second threat, and it is one that most casual weather watchers will underestimate if they see only the snow headlines, the ice threat. The Fox Forecast Centre identified the greatest icing concern as centred along the Interstate 70 corridor and through the Ohio River Valley. This is a specific geographic band that runs from the eastern Midwest through central Ohio, West Virginia, and into Kentucky and Virginia. Along this band, the overrunning setup creates conditions where precipitation falls as rain at higher altitudes, descends through cold air near the surface, and arrives at the ground as freezing rain liquid water that freezes on contact with any surface that is below freezing. Freezing rain coats surfaces uniformly roads, bridges, tree branches, and overhead structures in areas where surface temperatures stay below freezing. SevereWeather.eu confirmed this specific threat in their analysis, noting that the temperature contrast along the Arctic surge would be intense enough to support freezing rain development from Kentucky through Virginia and into parts of North Carolina. Their data confirmed that local ice accumulation from this event is possible in a range that reaches around half an inch in the most heavily affected areas. Extending beyond that band, the ice threat carries into parts of the mid-Atlantic region and into the interior valleys of Pennsylvania, where cold air has a tendency to become trapped at the surface even as warmer air moves above it. Let's be direct about what that ice threat means in practical terms without crossing into speculation. Half an inch of ice accumulation on surfaces that are already cold and already carrying a snowpack from Hernando is not a trivial event. Ice accumulation in that range coats everything. It coats it uniformly, in a way that is largely invisible until surfaces are tested. The Fox Forecast Centre and AccuWeather have both flagged the ice component of Storm 2 as a genuine hazard, not a secondary footnote to the snow story. There is also an Arctic air component to Storm 2. SevereWeather.eu confirmed that Monday morning temperatures will drop into the mid-teens across the Great Lakes and Northeast, with the Midwest seeing lows in the 20s. This Arctic reinforcement is what locks the ice in place after it forms. Snow can be cleared. Some ice that forms during those temperature levels tends to persist for an extended period without treatment. The timing of Storm 2's heaviest impacts is significant in its own right. The Fox Forecast Center specifically flagged Monday morning as the window when fresh snow and locally ice or freezing rain would be disrupting areas from Chicago and Detroit through to New York City and Philadelphia. Severeweather.eu confirmed Monday morning as the key travel window for this storm, noting that the storm will barrel across parts of the nation this Sunday and Monday, leading to disruptions with a wintry mix of snow and ice. Storm 2 is a dual-threat event: snow across the northern band, ice across the southern band, with a boundary between them that is still not precisely locked in by forecast models. It is moving through a region that has already been hit by one of the most powerful blizzards in decades. It is bringing reinforcing Arctic cold that will keep whatever it deposits in place for days, and it is arriving in the exact cities Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, New York that carry the largest concentrations of population in the affected 25-state zone. Fox Weather, AccuWeather, Severeweather.eu and the National Weather Service are all watching the same setup. The consensus is that Storm 2 carries the highest combination of snowfall and icing potential of the three systems. The exact geographic distribution of those hazards is still coming into focus, but the broad picture is confirmed. And just when Storm 2 starts to clear out, just when the snow band exits the northeast and the Arctic air settles over the region, something less predictable has already started forming to the west. Storm 3 arrives on a date that forecasters note carries a particular irony, and its exact path is still being refined, because small track changes produce meaningfully different outcomes. Let's get into Storm 3, and let's talk about what it means that it arrives on the first day of spring. There is a part of Storm 2 that is not going to make the top of the snow forecast headlines. The snow numbers are going to dominate the coverage because they're easy to communicate and they're tied to the cities that get the most media attention: Chicago, New York, Philadelphia. But inside Storm 2, running quietly alongside the snow story, there is a more specific, more targeted hazard that affects a different slice of geography. And it is the kind of hazard that tends to get overlooked precisely because it doesn't get as much attention as a major snowfall event in a large city. The ice storm embedded inside Storm 2 is the part of this weather event I want to spend real time on, because the data confirmed by Severeweather.eu, corroborated by the Fox Forecast Center, and flagged in the National Weather Service Outlook describes a band of freezing rain and ice accumulation that stretches from Kentucky through Virginia and into the Carolinas, and within that band there are specific terrain features that will concentrate the worst of it in locations that have been vulnerable to this kind of event before. Let's start with the mechanics of why ice forms here and not 50 miles to the north. When the overrunning pattern gets fully established warm, moist air from the Gulf riding up over the cold surface air, the exact position of the temperature boundary at the surface determines whether precipitation arrives as snow, sleet, or freezing rain. Across the band from the Ohio Valley into the mid-Atlantic, that boundary runs right through terrain that is deeply varied. Valleys, ridges, hollows, river basins, and in those valleys, cold air does something very specific. It sinks. Cold air is denser than warm air. It flows downhill. It pools at the lowest points, and it stays there, trapped by the geography, long after the air above it has warmed enough to support rain instead of snow. This is the mechanism that the Fox Forecast Center described, specifically, when discussing Storm 2's ice threat across Pennsylvania. Their statement was direct. Significant icing will be a concern across Pennsylvania, where below freezing air will stay trapped in the valleys. That is not a projection extrapolated from speculation, that is a forecast from the Fox Forecast Center based on the confirmed atmospheric setup, and it reflects something that happens in these valleys regularly when the overrunning pattern gets established. The valley air stays cold. The precipitation falls as rain from above. The rain hits surfaces that are below freezing. Ice forms. But this isn't limited to Pennsylvania. The band that Severeweather.eu confirmed runs from Kentucky through Virginia and into parts of North Carolina. The Ohio River Valley is explicitly flagged as the center of the greatest icing concern, and the Ohio Valley is a large, densely populated region that includes major metro areas and their surrounding counties. The E70 corridor sits directly within the zone the Fox Forecast Center, identified as the geographic heart of the ice threat. And ice behaves differently from snow in one important way that forecasters consistently flag as underappreciated. Snow is heavy. It accumulates in ways that are visible, that can be measured in depth, that looks dramatic on camera. But it can be moved. It can be ploughed, shoveled, treated, cleared. The disruption it causes is real, but it is also addressable in ways that society has developed infrastructure and techniques to handle over many decades of winter weather. Ice is different in a fundamental way. Ice coats surfaces uniformly. It does not pile up in drifts that can be pushed to the side. It forms a layer sometimes paper thin, sometimes more substantial on every exposed surface simultaneously. Roads, bridges, sidewalks, tree branches, the stairs outside a front door. That coating does not respond to a plough the way snow does. It requires treatment with specific materials. And even those treatments have limits when temperatures drop as low as Storm 2's Arctic air component is expected to push them. Ice that forms on surfaces in single-digit or low-teen temperatures is not ice that standard treatment addresses easily. SevereWeather.eu's confirmed data places the upper end of potential ice accumulation in the most heavily affected areas at around half an inch. That may sound modest when compared to the snowfall totals being discussed in the same forecast period, but half an inch of ice accumulation on a surface is not a coating that can be ignored. It is the kind of accumulation that adds weight to tree branches and overhead structures and makes surfaces difficult to treat, and that persist for days or longer in the cold temperatures that follow Storm 2's passage. The Pennsylvania valleys are not in the heart of the major snow story. Communities there won't see blizzard conditions or major snow totals. But they are in the zone where the most physically disruptive component of Storm 2 is expected to land, and the confirmation of that threat from multiple independent sources, SevereWeather.eu, the Fox Forecast Center, and the National Weather Service makes it worth tracking as closely as any snow total in Chicago or Philadelphia. If you have family in Kentucky, Virginia, West Virginia, or the interior valleys of Pennsylvania, this part of Storm 2's story is the one that applies most directly to them. The ice band is confirmed, its geographic position is still being refined as the storm gets closer, but the broad band from the Ohio Valley into the mid-Atlantic is established in the current forecast guidance. There is one more storm in this sequence, and in some ways, Storm 3 is the most interesting of the three, not because it is the most severe, but because it is the most uncertain. And that uncertainty itself is part of the story. It arrives on a specific date that carries a kind of weather irony that is almost too perfect to be believed, and it carries its own ice threat, one centered in the same Pennsylvania valleys that Storm 2 already hit. Let's get there. Storm 3 arrives last, and in the context of this three-storm sequence, the word last might lead you to assume it's the weakest or the least worth paying attention to. But Storm 3 is actually the most fascinating of the three, not because it is the strongest, but because the forecasting community is being unusually honest about how much uncertainty still surrounds its exact behavior. And that uncertainty is itself a story worth telling carefully. Let's start with what is confirmed. Storm 3 is expected to arrive on Tuesday, according to the Fox Forecast Center's confirmed outlook. It develops from a specific atmospheric interaction. Warm air from the south getting caught between the Arctic high-pressure system that is exiting off the eastern seaboard, the same high that is going to be pushing Storm 2 eastward, and a developing low-pressure system forming in the plains. That collision of departing cold and developing warmth creates Storm 3's core. The Fox Forecast Center described the setup directly in their forecast. This storm is expected to deliver mostly rain south of the Interstate 90 corridor, with snow and ice north of it. Interstate 90 is a useful geographic reference point here. It runs roughly east to west across the northern tier of the country, across the northern Great Plains, through Chicago, across Michigan and Ohio, through Cleveland and Buffalo, and across upstate New York, through Albany and Boston. South of that line, Storm 3 looks like a rain event for most locations. North of it, the temperatures stay cold enough for winter precipitation snow in some areas, ice in others. And in the Pennsylvania valleys, which we just discussed at length in the context of Storm 2, the cold air trapping mechanism is expected to persist and deliver icing concerns again. The Fox Forecast Center stated explicitly, "Significant icing will be a concern across Pennsylvania, funds where below freezing air will stay trapped in the valleys. This is the same mechanism, the same geography, hit twice within the same week by two separate systems." Now for the uncertainty, because it is a significant part of the Storm 3 story, and it would be a disservice to present it otherwise. The exact track of Storm 3 is still shifting in the computer forecast models. AccuWeather and USA Today have both reported on this uncertainty, and their reporting is worth taking seriously. A storm that tracks slightly farther north than current guidance suggests would change the rain-snow line significantly, pushing the snow and ice threat into areas currently expected to see rain, and potentially bringing a completely different kind of storm experience to parts of the Mid-Atlantic and the Great Lakes region that thought they were going to come through this third event relatively unscathed. AccuWeather specifically flagged a meaningful consequence of that potential northern track shift. In areas where Storm 3's rain falls on top of frozen or near-frozen surfaces, urban flooding becomes a possibility. More significantly, a farther north track raises the risk of ice jams along rivers and streams that are still carrying above normal water from Hernando's snowmelt. AccuWeather specifically flagged this risk in USA Today. A farther north track could elevate the risk of ice jams and related stream and river flooding. That is a documented risk that AccuWeather is actively monitoring as Storm 3 continues to develop. The National Weather Service has also noted that Storm 3 carries the potential for plowable snow and some ice, in a scenario where its track stays northward, and the winter precipitation band positions itself more aggressively across the northeast and mid-Atlantic. What does this mean for the viewer trying to track this storm? It means that Storm 3's exact path is still being refined by forecast models, and the gap between its best-case scenario and its more impactful scenarios is wider than it is for either Storm 1 or Storm 2. Storm 1 was well-defined, a fast-moving clipper with modest accumulations. Storm 2 is clearly the most hazardous of the three in terms of snowfall volume and the dual snow-pluses threat. But Storm 3 carries a range of outcomes that forecasters are being careful not to collapse into a single narrative before the data supports it. And then there is the date. Storm 3 arrives on, or just around the first day of March. Specifically, on or just after the first day of meteorological spring. This is not a calendar coincidence. Meteorological spring is a formally defined season. It begins on March 1st. Not the astronomical spring of late March, but the meteorological designation that divides the year into 3-month climate seasons. March 1st is the beginning of spring by that definition, and Storm 3, the final member of this 3-storm sequence, is arriving precisely at that boundary. There is something in that timing that tells the fuller story of this winter better than any single storm total or forecast model output could. The same atmospheric pattern that produced Hernando is generating these 3 storms right at the moment the calendar officially marks the start of meteorological spring. That timing, and the atmospheric reason behind it, leads directly to the question we haven't fully answered yet. Why are 3 storms forming back-to-back in the first place? Why has this winter been so relentless? And is what we've been watching this season truly a pattern or a series of events that happen to feel connected? That's exactly where we're going next, and it's the part of this story that most weather coverage never gets around to explaining. Most weather coverage stops at the individual storm. To understand why 3 storms are lining up back-to-back, we need to step back from the individual storms and look at the atmospheric pattern that has been generating all of them, that has been producing this entire winter's behaviour, and that architecture, once you see it clearly, makes the 3-storm sequence we've been walking through feel like exactly what it is. Not a random coincidence, but the predictable output of a weather pattern that has been locked in place for months. Let's start with the polar jet stream, because everything in this story ultimately traces back to it. The polar jet stream is a band of fast-moving wind that flows from west to east around the planet at higher altitudes, driven by the temperature difference between the cold polar regions and the warmer air to the south. The jet stream acts as a natural dividing line between cold Arctic air to the north and warmer air to the south. When that fence is strong and relatively straight, it does its job well. It keeps the coldest Arctic air penned up in the polar regions, and the weather it produces stays mostly north of the heavily populated parts of the United States. But the jet stream is not always straight. It can buckle. It can develop large, sweeping curves that dip far to the south, and when those dips become deep and persistent, they allow cold Arctic air to push farther south than it normally would, directly into the Midwest and Northeast. Storm systems form along the edges of those temperature contrasts, and if the jet stream stays buckled in a particular configuration for weeks at a time, those storms keep forming along the same track, driven by the same large-scale pattern. This winter, the polar jet stream has been running unusually far south, not occasionally, persistently. Severeweather.eu has tracked the southern lobe of the polar vortex, the atmospheric system that governs the jet stream's behaviour, sitting in a position that has been channeling Arctic air directly into the Midwest and Northeast with remarkable consistency throughout this winter season. That is confirmed in the National Weather Service's winter outlook and in the analysis published by multiple meteorological sources. The pattern has been the driver. Hernando was a product of that pattern. The three storms forming now are a continuation of it. Here is how severeweather.eu described the current setup. An active pattern remains in place across North America, with a deep cold wave surging from Canada into the northeast, as the southern lobe of the polar vortex digs south over the weekend through early next week. The key phrase there is, active pattern remains in place. Not a new pattern, the same one. The polar vortex's southern lobe has not retreated. It has not weakened enough to allow the jet stream to straighten out and stop delivering these cold, storm-generating setups to the eastern United States. The mechanism that produces these storms is worth understanding at a plain language level, because it makes the why 3 back-to-back question feel intuitive rather than mysterious. When the jet stream buckles south, and the polar vortex's lobe digs into the continent, or it creates a sharp temperature gradient and intense boundary between the Arctic air pressing down from Canada and the warmer air sitting across the southern states. Those contrasts where cold and warm air masses are forced against each other are where winter storms are born. The greater the contrast and the more persistent the jet stream buckle, the more organised and powerful the storms that form along that boundary. What has been happening this winter is that the jet stream has been maintaining a configuration that keeps that contrast sharp and that keeps it positioned right over the Midwest and Northeast. Each time a storm system forms and tracks through the region, it moves out to sea, the atmosphere refills with cold air from the north, and the conditions for the next system start building almost immediately. Storm 1, Storm 2, Saturn, and Storm 3 are not three unrelated weather events that happen to cluster in the same week by chance. They are three expressions of the same underlying pattern, arriving in rapid succession because the pattern itself has not shifted. This is the context that severeweather.eu's analysis of the current storm sequence makes explicit. The Alberta Clipper storm driving Storm 1 is, in their words, fueled by a fresh surge of Arctic air mass diving south from Canada into the US, the same Arctic air that has been making these incursions all winter, the same system that generated Hernando, the same system that will continue generating active winter weather until the jet stream shifts. What makes this even more significant is the scale of what's happening at the very top of the atmosphere right now. Multiple meteorological sources, including severeweather.eu and weather.com, seem to have reported that a significant disruption in the stratospheric polar vortex appears to be approaching in March, a potential final collapse that could ultimately cause the jet stream to shift position and allow the Arctic pattern that has dominated this winter to break down. Severeweather.eu has specifically flagged that a major stratospheric wind reversal is now appearing in the latest forecasts, signalling a final collapse of the polar vortex as we head into late winter. This is not a forecast for the three storms we've been discussing. It is a signal from the upper atmosphere that the larger driver of this winter's relentless cold and storminess may eventually loosen its grip. But here is the important distinction. That stratospheric disruption takes time to work its way down through the atmosphere and actually change conditions at the surface. Based on the available atmospheric data, the second half of March looks meaningfully different from the first half. The pattern may finally shift. The cold wave that has been producing Hernando and now these three back-to-back storms may have an end date on the horizon. Most people watching storm coverage never hear this part of the story. They see the individual forecast, they track the individual storm, and then they move on until the next one arrives. But the storms themselves are just the surface expression of a much larger atmospheric conversation that has been happening all winter, a conversation between Arctic cold to the north, Gulf warmth to the south, and a jet stream that has been holding a position that keeps generating these setups over the Midwest and Northeast again and again. The National Weather Service confirmed in its winter outlook that cold and storminess have been the defining characteristic of this season across the Midwest and Northeast. The atmospheric data supports that. The storm history of this winter supports that. And the three storms now moving through confirm it one more time. One important thing remains for us to address. What happens after Storm 3 clears? Because the atmospheric story doesn't end when the third system exits the northeast. There are downstream effects still developing effects that involve the water that will eventually come from all of this snow and ice, and a forecast pattern for later in March that forecasters are beginning to watch with a different kind of attention. That's where we close this out. But the story doesn't end when Storm 3 exits the northeast on Wednesday. Because all of that snow and ice that has been accumulating across the region, starting with Hernando's near-historic totals, and now layered over three additional systems, has to go somewhere eventually. And the way it goes somewhere is through melting. And the way melting works in the aftermath of a cold, heavy winter like this one can create its own set of concerns that are worth understanding before they arrive. AccuWeather's meteorologist Alex Sosnowski flagged this in his confirmed forecast analysis. When Storm 3 moves through, the areas that receive its rainfall south of Interstate 90 will be adding liquid water on top of terrain that is already carrying significant snowpack from Hernando. Where that rain falls on frozen ground, it has nowhere to soak in, it runs off. And in regions like the Ohio Valley and the Mid-Atlantic, where rivers and streams are already above their normal winter levels due to snowmelt, that additional input matters. Urban flooding is a confirmed possibility in areas south of the snowline during Storm 3, according to AccuWeather's reporting in USA Today. Then there is the ice jam concern that AccuWeather specifically raised in connection with Storm 3's northern track scenario. If Storm 3 tracks farther north than the current guidance suggests, the storm's rain could fall on top of river ice that is still present along waterways in the Midwest and Northeast. That rain accelerates the melting of surface ice, but the ice underneath, still solid, still in the river channel, can break up in chunks that pile against each other and create jams. Those jams back up water behind them, and when they release that backed up water rapidly. USA Today reported AccuWeather's warning directly. A farther north track could elevate the risk of ice jams and related stream and river flooding. That is a specific confirmed downstream risk from this 3-storm sequence, and it is one worth tracking in the days after Storm 3 clears. Beyond the immediate aftermath of these 3 systems, the atmospheric picture for later in March is beginning to look different. The sources we've been referencing throughout this video, severeweather.eu, the National Weather Service, AccuWeather, all point to a potential shift in the large-scale pattern as March progresses. The final disruption of the stratospheric polar vortex, which multiple meteorological sources have been tracking, may ultimately cause the jet stream to reposition and allow the pattern that has been fueling this relentless winter to break down. The second half of March, in the current forecast outlook, looks warmer than the first half. The atmospheric pattern that has driven this winter's storms may begin to shift as March progresses, according to severeweather.eu and AccuWeather. But what that transition looks like on the ground, what it means for the snowpack that is still sitting across the northeast, for the rivers that are already elevated, for the frozen terrain that will eventually warm and release all of that water, is a story that is still developing. As temperatures gradually rise in the weeks ahead, the snowpack left behind by this storm sequence will begin to melt, a process that AccuWeather has flagged as worth monitoring for river levels across the Ohio Valley and Northeast, particularly in seasons where the snowpack has built as high as this one has. For now, the focus remains on what is immediately in front of us. Storm 2 and Storm 3 are still developing. The forecast for both systems is still being refined as the storms get closer and computer models get sharper. If you want to stay ahead of this as it unfolds, if you're in one of the 25 states in the crosshairs, and you want to know how the Storm 2 ice band is positioning, how far north Storm 3 tracks, and what the river flooding outlook looks like as temperatures eventually rise, make sure you're subscribed. Storm 2's ice threat in particular is worth watching closely as Monday approaches. The details on that ice band are still coming into focus, and when they do, that update matters. If you want to stay ahead of this as Storm 2 and Storm 3 continue to develop, hit the like button before you go, and drop a comment telling me which state you're watching from. Whether you're in Chicago, Columbus, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Albany, Boston, or anywhere across that 25-state belt that is about to see this sequence play out, I want to know where you are. We'll stay on top of this together.